Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo. We are 19% of the way through. I did not look to see what chapter we're on. Give me 1 second. Let's pretend that I'm prepared for like 2 seconds. We're on part 1, second book, chapter 17. Okay, so recap. What happened last time? All we did was follow this group of people on the ship that dropped off the boy. So, 2 times ago, we read about the boy's experience, and this last time, it was all about the people on the ship. And as they're leaving, and there's like this huge storm coming in, and they almost die like 3 or 4 times, and they just keep navigating. They can't control their ship anymore, all of these other things. There's one point where they're going directly towards a lighthouse and they can't really steer anything, so they rip off a plank of the ship and they like use that as a rudder and they get away. And then there's like these other cliffs that they try to get away from, and like the wind changes like right at the last moment, all of these things, and we think that they're in the clear. They just survived this massive storm. um but then one of the crewmates goes down below deck, comes back up, and is like, the ship is taking water. So cool. I think that's exactly the last thing that happened. Yep. Okay, cool. So part 1, book the second, chapter 17. The last resource. There was a hole in the keel. A leak had sprung. When it happened, no one could have said. Was it when they touched the caskets? Was it off Ortok? Was it when they were whirled about the shallows west of Origami? Was it more probable that they had touched some rock there? They had struck against some hidden buttress, which they had not felt in the midst of the convulsive fury of the wind which was tossing them. In that tetanus, who would feel a prick? The other sailor, the southern Basque, whose name was Ave Maria, went down into the hold too, came on deck again, and said, "There are 2 varas of water in the hold." About 6 feet. Ave Maria added, "In less than 40 minutes we shall sink." Where was the leak? They couldn't find it. It was hidden by the water which was filling up the hold. The vessel had a hole in her hull somewhere under the water line, quite forward in the keel. Impossible to find it, impossible to check it. They had a wound which they could not stanch. The water, however, was not rising very fast. The chief called out, "We must work the pump." Galdezayan replied, "We have no pump left." "Then," said the chief, "we must make for land." "Where is the land?" "I don't know." "Nor I." "But it must be somewhere." "True enough." "Let someone steer for it." "We have no pilot." "Stand to the tiller yourself." "We have lost the tiller." "Let's rig one out of the first beam we can lay hands on. Nails, a hammer, quick, some tools." Carpenter's box. The carpenter's box is overboard. We have no tools." "We'll steer all the same, no matter where. The rudder is lost." "Where's the boat?" "We'll get in and row." "The boat is lost." "We'll row the wreck." "We have lost the oars." "We'll sail." "We have lost the sails and the mast." "We'll rig one up with a pole and a tarpaulin for sail. Let's get clear of this and trust in the wind." There is no wind. The wind, indeed, had left them. The storm had fled, and its departure, which they had believed to mean safety, meant, in fact, destruction. Had the sou'wester continued, it might have driven them wildly on some shore, might have beaten the leak in speed, might, perhaps have carried them to some propitious sandbank and cast them on it before the hooker foundered. The swiftness of the storm bearing them away might have enabled them to reach land, but no more wind, no more hope. They were going to die because the hurricane was over. The end was near. Wind, hail, the hurricane, the whirlwind, these are wild combatants that may be overcome. The storm can be taken in the weak point of its armor. There are resources against the violence which continually lays itself open, is off its guard, and often hits wide. But nothing is to be done against a calm. It offers nothing to the grasp of which you can lay hold. The winds are a charge of Cossacks. Stand your ground, and they disperse. Calms are the pincers of the executioner. The water, deliberate and sure, irrepressible and heavy, rose in the hold, and as it rose the vessel sank. It was happening slowly. Those on board the wreck of the Matutina felt that most hopeless of catastrophes, an inert catastrophe undermining them. The still and sinister certainty of their fate petrified them. No stir in the air, no movement on the sea. The motionless is the inexorable. Absorption was sucking them down silently through the depths of the dumb waters, without anger, without passion, not willing, not knowing, not caring. The fatal center of the globe was attracting them downwards. Horror and repose amalgamating them with itself. It was no longer the open mouth of the sea, the double jaw of the wind and wave, vicious in its threat, the grin of a waterspout, the foaming appetite of the breakers. It was as if the wretched beings had under them the black yawn of the infinite. They felt themselves sinking into death's peaceful depths. The height between the vessel and the water was lessening. That was all. They could calculate her disappearance to the moment. It was the exact reverse of submersion by the rising tide. The water was not rising toward them. They were sinking towards it. They were digging their own grave. Their own weight was their sexton. They were being executed, not by the law of man, but by the law of things. The snow was falling, and as the wreck was now motionless, this white lint made a cloth over the deck and covered the vessel as with a winding sheet. The hold was becoming fuller and deeper, no means of getting at the leak. They struck a light and fixed 3 or 4 torches in holes as best they could. Galdezayan brought some old leathern buckets, and they tried to bale and hold out, standing in a row to pass them from hand to hand, but the buckets were past use. The leather of some was unstitched. There were holes in the bottoms of the others, and the buckets emptied themselves on the way. The difference in quantity between the water which was making its way in and that which they returned to the sea was ludicrous. For a ton that entered a glassful was baled out. They did not improve their condition. It was like the expenditure of a miser, trying to exhaust 1,000,000 halfpenny by halfpenny. The chief said, "Let us lighten the wreck." During the storm they had lashed together the few chests which were on the deck. These remained tied to the stump of the mast. They undid the lashings and rolled the chests overboard through a breach in the gunwale. One of these trunks belonged to the Basque women, who could not repress a sigh. "Oh, my new cloak lined with scarlet! Oh, my poor stockings of birchen bark lace! Oh, my silver earrings to wear at Mass on May Day!" The deck cleared. There remained the cabin to be seen to. It was greatly encumbered. In it were, as may be remembered, the luggage belonging to the passengers, and the bales belonging to the sailors. They took the luggage and threw it over the gunwale. They carried up the bales and cast them into the sea. Thus they emptied the cabin. The lantern, the cap, the barrels, the sacks, the bales, and the water butts, the pot of soup, all went over into the waves. They unscrewed the nuts of the iron stove, long since extinguished. They pulled it out, hoisted it on deck, dragged it to the side, and threw it out of the vessel. They cast overboard everything they could pull out of the deck, chains, shrouds, and torn rigging. From time to time the chief took a torch, and throwing its light on the figures painted on the prow to show the draught of water, looked to see how deep the wreck had settled down. End of the chapter. All right, so now the storm has ended, the storm has passed. And they're like, woohoo, we're gonna live. But the ship is now sinking. It's taking water, and they don't know exactly when this happened, but it is. And they are trying to lighten the load on the ship so that they don't sink quite as fast. So they're throwing all of their luggage over, everything that's basically not them, throwing overboard to make it go a little bit slower until they can figure something out. And so they're going through the list of possible things that they could do to fix it, or that they could sail away, or that they could do all of these other things. And as they're going through the list, it's like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. We can't do that. Nope. Nope, 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 nope. So, future's looking a little grim. All right. Chapter 18. The highest resource. The wreck, being lightened, was sinking more slowly, but none the less surely. The hopelessness of their situation was without resource, without mitigation. They had exhausted their last expedient. "Is there anything else we can throw overboard?" The doctor, whom everyone had forgotten, rose from the companion and said, "Yes." "What?" asked the chief. The doctor answered, "Our crime." They shuddered and all cried out, "Amen." The doctor, standing up, pale, raised his hand to heaven, saying, "Kneel down." They wavered. To waver is the preface to kneeling down. The doctor went on, "Let us throw our crimes into the sea. They weigh us down. It is they that are sinking the ship. Let us think no more of safety. Let us think of salvation. Our last crime above all, the crime which we committed, or rather completed just now. Oh, wretched beings who are listening to me, it is that which is overwhelming us. For those who leave intended murder behind them, it is an impious insolence to attempt the abyss. He who sins against the child sins against God. True, we were obliged to put to sea, but it is certain perdition. The storm, warned by the shadow of our crime, came on. It is well. Regret nothing, however. There, not far off in the darkness, are the sands of Valville and Cape La Hogue. It is France. There was but one possible shelter for us, which was Spain. France is no less dangerous to us than England. Our deliverance from the sea would have led but to the gibbet, hanged or drowned. We had no alternative. God has chosen for us. Let us give him thanks. He has vouchsafed us the grave which cleanses. Brethren, the inevitable hand is in it. Remember that it was we who just now did our best to send on high that child, and that at this very moment, now as I speak, there is perhaps above our heads a soul accusing us before a judge whose eye is on us. Let us make the best use of this last respite. Let us make an effort, if we still may, to repair, as far as we are able, the evil that we have wrought. If the child survives, let us come to his aid. If he is dead, let us seek his forgiveness. Let us cast our crime from us. Let us ease our consciousness of its weight. Let us strive that our soul be not swallowed up before God, for that is the awful shipwreck. Bodies go to the fishes, souls to the devils. Have pity on yourselves. Kneel down, I tell you. Repentance is the bark which never sinks. You have lost your compass. You are wrong. You still have prayer. The wolves became lambs. Such transformations occur in last agonies. Tigers lick the crucifix. When the dark portal opens ajar, belief is difficult, unbelief impossible. However imperfect may be the different sketches of religion essayed by man, even when his belief is shapeless, even when the outline of the dogma is not in harmony with the lineaments of the eternity he foresees, there comes in his last hour a trembling of the soul. There is something which will begin when life is over. This thought impresses the last pang. A man's dying agony is the expiration of a term. In that fatal second he feels weighing on him a diffused responsibility. That which has been complicates that which is to be. The past returns and enters into the future. What is known becomes as much an abyss as the unknown. And the two chasms, the one which is full by his faults, the other of his anticipations, mingle their reverberations. It is this confusion of the two gulfs which terrifies the dying man. They had spent their last grain of hope on the direction of life, hence they turned in the other. Their only remaining chance was in its dark shadow. They understood it. It came on them as a lugubrious flash, followed by the relapse of horror. That which is intelligible to the dying man is as what is perceived in the lightning. Everything, then nothing. You see, then all is blindness. After death, the eye will reopen, and that which was a flash will become a sun. They cried out to the doctor, Thou, there is no one but thee. We will obey thee. What must we do? Speak. The doctor answered, The question is how to pass over the unknown precipice and reach the other bank of life, which is beyond the tomb. Being the one who knows the most, my danger is greater than yours. You do well to leave the choice of the bridge to him whose burden is the heaviest. He added, Knowledge is a weight added to conscience. He continued, How much time do we have still? Galdezayan looked at the watermark and answered, A little more than a quarter of an hour. Good, said the doctor. The low hood of the companion on which he leant his elbows made a sort of table. The doctor took from his pocket his inkhorn and pen, and his pocket-book, out of which he drew a parchment, the same one on the back of which he had written, a few hours before, some 20 cramped and crooked lines. A light, he said. The snow, falling like the spray of a cataract, had extinguished the torches one after another. There was but one left. Ave Maria took it out of the place where it had been stuck, and holding it in his hand came and stood by the doctor's side. The doctor replaced his pocket-book in his pocket, put down the pen and inkhorn on the hood of the companion, unfolded the parchment, and said, Listen. Then, in the midst of the sea, on the failing bridge, a sort of shuddering flooring of the tomb, the doctor began a solemn reading, to which all the shadows seemed to listen. The doomed men bowed their heads around him. The flaming of the torch intensified their pallor. What the doctor read was written in English. Now and then, when one of those woebegone looks seemed to ask an explanation, the doctor would stop, to repeat, whether in French or Spanish, Basque or Italian, the passage he had just read. Stifled sobs and hollow beatings of the breast were heard. The wreck was sinking more and more. The reading over, the doctor placed the parchment flat on the companion, seized his pen, and a clear margin which he had carefully left at the bottom of what he had written. He signed himself. This is quite a name. Gernardus G. Stimonde, doctor. Then, turning towards the others, he said, "Come and sign." The Basque woman approached, took the pen, and signed herself Assumption. She handed the pen to the Irish woman, who, not knowing how to write, made a cross. The doctor, by the side of this cross, wrote Barbara Fermoy, of Tirith Island, in the Hebrides. Then he handed the pen to the chief of the band. The chief signed Gaisdora, capital. The Genoese signed himself under the chief's name, Giangirate. We're getting a lot of fun names. The Languedocian signed Jacques Courtois, alias the Narbonnais. The provincial signed Luc-Pierre Capgaroupe of the galleys of Mahone. Under these signatures, the doctor added a note. Of the crew of 3 men, the skipper having been washed overboard by a sea, but 2 remain, and they have signed. The 2 sailors affixed their names underneath the note. The northern Basque signed himself Galdesaean. The southern Basque signed Ave Maria, robber. Then the doctor said, "Capgaroupe." "Here," said the provincial. "Have you hard quinan's flask?" "Yes." "Give it to me." Capgaroupe drank off the last mouthful of brandy and handed the flask to the doctor. The water was rising in the hold. The wreck was sinking deeper and deeper into the sea. The sloping edges of the ship were covered by a thin, gnawing wave, which was rising. All were crowded on the center of the deck. The doctor dried the ink on the signatures by the heat of the torch, and folding the parchment into a narrower compass than the diameter of the neck, put it into the flask. He called for the cork. "I don't know where it is," said Capgaroupe. "Here is a piece of rope," said Jacques. The doctor corked the flask with a bit of rope, and asked for some tar. Galdesaean went forward, extinguished the signal light with a piece of tow, took the vessel in which it was contained from the stern, and brought it, half full of burning tar, to the doctor. The flask holding the parchment which they had all signed was corked and tarred over. "It is done," said the doctor. And from out of their mouths, vaguely stammered in every language, came the dismal utterances of the catacombs. Mea culpa, assisie, adorai, amen, ainsi soidin. It was as though the somber voices of Babel were scattered through the shadows as heaven uttered its awful refusal to hear them. The doctor turned away from his companions in crime and distress, and took a few steps towards the gunwale. Reaching the side, he looked into space and said in a deep voice, "Bist du bei mir?" Footnote, and it says, "Art thou near me?" Perchance he was addressing some phantom. The wreck was sinking. Behind the doctor, all the others were in a dream. Prayer mastered them by main force. They did not bow. They were bent. There was something involuntary in their condition. They wavered as a sail flaps when the breeze fails, and the haggard group took by degrees, with clasping of hands and prostration of foreheads, attitudes various, yet of humiliation. Some strange reflection of the deep seemed to soften their villainous features. The doctor returned towards them. Whatever had been his past, the old man was great in the presence of the catastrophe. The doctor turned towards them. Whatever had been his past, the old man was great in the presence of the catastrophe. The deep reserve of nature which enveloped him preoccupied without disconcerting him. He was not one to be taken unawares. Over him was the calm of a silent horror. On his countenance the majesty of God's will comprehended. This old and thoughtful outlaw unconsciously assumed the air of a pontiff. He said, "Attend to me." He contemplated for a moment the waste of water and added, "Now we are going to die." Then he took the torch from the hands of Ave Maria and waved it. A spark broke from it and flew into the night. Then the doctor cast the torch into the sea. The torch was extinguished. All light disappeared. Nothing left but the huge, unfathomable shadow. It was like the filling up of the grave. In the darkness, the doctor was heard saying, "Let us pray." All knelt down. It was no longer on the snow, but in the water that they knelt. They had but a few minutes more. The doctor alone remained standing. The flakes of snow falling on him had sprinkled him with the white tears and made him visible on the background of darkness. He might have been the speaking statue of the shadow. The doctor made the sign of the cross and raised his voice, while beneath his feet he felt that almost imperceptible oscillation which prefaces the moment in which a wreck is about to founder. He said, "Pater noster qui es in coelis." The provincial repeated in French. I don't speak French. I also don't speak Basque. I don't speak any of these languages. Notre Père qui est aux cieux. Something like that. The Irish woman repeated in Gaelic, understood by the Basque woman. Ar nafer ata ar niam. The doctor continued. Oh my gosh, can we have it in English, please? Sanctificator nomen tuum. And then it goes through the different languages again. Adveniat regnum tuum, continued the doctor. And then it goes through French and Gaelic. As they knelt, the waters had risen to their shoulders. The doctor went on. Fiat voluntas tua, que votre volonté soit faite, stammered the provincial. And the Irish woman and Basque woman cried, Diontar do foil ar al harm. Sicut in col, sicut in terra, said the doctor. No voice answered him. He looked down. All their heads were under water. They had let themselves be drowned on their knees. The doctor took in his right hand the flask which he had placed on the companion and raised it above his head. The wreck was going down. As he sank, the doctor murmured the rest of the prayer. For an instant his shoulders were above the water, then his head, then nothing remained but his arm holding up the flask, as if he were showing it to the infinite. His arm disappeared. There was no greater fold in the deep sea than there would have been on a tune of oil. The snow continued falling. One thing floated and was carried by the waves into the darkness. It was the tarred flask, kept afloat by its osier cover. Okay, end of the second book, end of the chapter. Okay, so in this one, they've thrown everything over the boat and they're still sinking and they're like, okay, holy crap, what do we do? And the doctor is like, excuse me, we must throw the heaviest thing over the ship, and that is our guilt. So he reads this thing that has been written in his pocketbook. He has all of them sign it. They put it in a flask. They seal the flask. They throw the flask overboard. And now they're praying in their various languages. Everybody is kneeling, and now they are like kneeling in the water. That's how high it has already risen. They only have a few minutes, and they're going through the prayer in their different languages in turn. And then they all die. And that's where this part ended. We finished book 2, or book the second, excuse me. So now we are on part 1 Book the Third. The Child in the Shadow. Okay, so we're going back to the child. Excellent. Let's do it. Chapter 1. Chesel. 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 Chesil, if you will. The storm was no less severe on land than on sea. The same wild enfranchisement of the elements had taken place around the abandoned child. The weak and innocent become their sport in the expenditure of the unreasoning rage of their blind forces. Shadows discern not, and things inanimate have not the clemency they are supposed to possess. On the land there were but little wind. There was an inexplicable dumbness in the cold. There was no hail. The thickness of the falling snow was fearful. Hailstones strike, harass, bruise, stun, crush. Snowflakes do worse. Soft and inexorable, the snowflake does its work in silence. Touch it, and it melts. It is pure, even as the hypocrite is candid. It is by white particles, slowly heaped upon each other, that the flake becomes an avalanche, and the knave a criminal. The child continued to advance into the mist. The fog presents but a soft obstacle, hence its danger. It yields and yet persists. Mist, like snow, is full of treachery. The child, strange wrestler at war with all these risks, had succeeded in reaching the bottom of the descent and had gained Chesel. Without knowing it, he was on an isthmus, with the ocean on each side, so that he could not lose his way in the fog, in the snow, or in the darkness, without falling into the deep waters of the gulf on the right hand, or the raging billows of the high sea on the left. He was traveling on, in ignorance, between these two abysses. The Isthmus of Portland was at this period singularly sharp and rugged. Nothing remains at this date of its past configuration. Since the idea of manufacturing Portland stone into Roman cement was first seized, the whole rock has been subjected to an alteration which has completely changed its original appearance. Calcareous, 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 rock, slate, and trap are still to be found there, rising from layers of conglomerate, like teeth from a gum. But the pickaxe has broken up and leveled those bristling, rugged peaks which were once the fearful perches of the ossifrage. The summits exist no longer where the labs and the skua gulls used to flock together, soaring, like the envious, to sully high places. In vain might you seek the tall monolith called Godolphin. It is spelled like Godolphin, and I fought the urge to not say that, and then continued to say it. In vain might you seek the tall monolith called Godolphin, an old British word signifying white eagle. In summer you may still gather on those surfaces, pierced and perforated like a sponge, rosemary, pennyroyal, wide hyssop, and sea fennel, which when infused makes a good cordial, and that herb full of knots, which grows in the sand and from which they make matting. But you no longer find gray amber, or black tin, or that triple species of slate, one sort green, one blue, and the third the color of sage leaves. The foxes, the badgers, the otters, and the martens have taken themselves off, on the cliffs of Portland as well as the extremity of Cornwall, where there were at one time chamois, none remain. They still fish in some inlets for plaice and pilchards, but the scared salmon no longer ascend the way between Michaelmas and Christmas to spawn. No more are seen there, as during the reign of Elizabeth, those old unknown birds, as large as hawks, who could cut an apple in two, but ate only the pips. You never meet those crows with yellow beaks, called Cornish coughs in English, Pyrrhocorax in Latin, who, in their mischief, would drop burning twigs on thatched roofs. Nor that magic bird, the fulmar, a wanderer from the Scottish try that again. Nor that magic bird, the fulmar, a wanderer from the Scottish archipelago, dropping from his bill an oil which the islanders used to burn in their lamps. Nor do you ever find in the evening, in the plash of the ebbing tide, that ancient, legendary neats, with the feet of a hog and the bleat of a calf. The tide no longer throws up the whiskered seal with its curled ears and sharp jaws, dragging itself along on its nailless paws. On that Portland, nowadays so changed as scarcely to be recognized, the absence of forests precluded nightingales, but now the falcon, the swan, and the wild goose have fled. The sheep of Portland nowadays are fat and have fine wool. The few scattered ewes which nibbled the salt grass there 2 centuries ago were small and tough and coarse in the fleece, as became Celtic flocks brought there by garlic-eating shepherds, who lived to 100, and who, at the distance of half a mile, could pierce a cuirass with their yard-long arrows. Uncultivated land makes coarse wool. The Chesil of today resembles in no particular the Chesil of the past. So much has it been disturbed by man and by those furious winds which gnaw the very stone. At present this tongue of land bears a railway, terminating in a pretty square of houses called Chesilton, and there is a Portland station. Railway carriages roll where seals used to crawl. The Isthmus of Portland 200 years ago was a back of sand, with a vertebral spine of rock. The child's danger changed its form. What he had had to fear in the descent was falling to the bottom of the precipice. In the isthmus, it was falling into the holes. After dealing with the precipice, he must deal with the pitfalls. Everything on the seashore is a trap. The rock is slippery, the strand is quicksand. Resting places are but snares. It is walking on ice which may suddenly crack and yawn with a fissure through which you disappear. The ocean has false stages below, like a well-arranged theater. The long backbone of granite, from which fall away both slopes of the isthmus, is awkward of access. It is difficult to find there what, in scene-shifters' language, are termed practicables. Man has no hospitality to hope for from the ocean, from the rock no more than from the wave. The sea is provident for the bird and the fish alone. Isthmuses are especially naked and rugged. The wave, which wears and mines them on either side, reduces them to the simplest form. Everywhere there were sharp relief ridges, cuttings, frightful fragments of torn stone, yawning with many points, like the jaws of a shark, breaknecks of wet moss, rapid slopes of rock ending in the sea. Whosoever undertakes to pass over an isthmus meets at every step misshapen blocks, as large as houses, in the forms of shin bones, shoulder blades, and thigh bones, the hideous anatomy of dismembered rocks. It is not without reason that these stria of the seashore are called coasts. There's a note right after that, and it says coasts. Costa, ribs. The wayfarer must get out as best he can from the confusion of these ruins. It is like journeying over the bones of an enormous skeleton. Put a child to this labor of Hercules. Broad daylight might have aided him. It was night. A guide was necessary. He was alone. All the vigor of mankind would not have been too much. He had but the feeble strength of a child. In default of a guide, a footpath might have aided him. There was none. By instinct he avoided the sharp ridge of the rocks and kept to the strand as much as possible. It was there that he met with the pitfalls. They were multiplied before him under 3 forms: the pitfalls of water, the pitfalls of snow, and the pitfall of sand. This last is the most dangerous of all, because the most illusory. To know the peril we face is alarming. To be ignorant of it is terrible. The child was fighting against unknown dangers. He was groping his way through something which might, perhaps, be the grave. He did not hesitate. He went round the rocks and avoided the crevices, guessed at the pitfalls, obeyed the twistings and turnings caused by such obstacles, yet he went on. Though unable to advance in a straight line, he walked with a firm step. When necessary, he drew back with energy. He knew how to tear himself in time from the horrid bird-lime of the quicksands. He shook the snow from about him. He entered the water more than once up to the knees. Directly that he left it, his wet knees were frozen by the intense cold of the night. He walked rapidly in his stiffened garments. Yet he took care to keep his sailor's coat dry and warm on his chest. He was still tormented by hunger. The chances of the abyss are illimitable. Everything is possible in it, even salvation. The issue may be found, though it be invisible. There we go. The issue may be found, though it be invisible. How the child, wrapped in a smothering, winding sheet of snow, lost on a narrow elevation between 2 jaws of an abyss, managed to cross the isthmus, is what he could not himself have explained. He had slipped, climbed, rolled, searched, walked, persevered. That is all. Such is the secret of all triumphs. At the end of somewhat less than half an hour, he felt that the ground was rising. He had reached the other shore. Leaving Chesil, he had gained terra firma. The bridge which now unites Sandford Castle with Smallmouth Sands did not then exist. It is probable that in his intelligent groping he had reascended as far as Wykes Regis, where there was then a tongue of sand, a natural road crossing East Fleet. He was saved from the isthmus, but he found himself again face to face with the tempest, with the cold, with the night. Before him once more lay the plain, shapeless, in the density of impenetrable shadow. He examined the ground, seeking a footpath. Suddenly he bent down. He had discovered in the snow something which seemed to him a track. It was indeed a track, the print of a foot. The print was cut out clearly in the whiteness of the snow, which rendered it distinctly visible. He examined it. It was a naked foot, too small for that of a man, too large for that of a child. It was probably the foot of a woman. Beyond that mark was another, then another, then another. The footprints followed each other at the distance of a step and struck across the plain to the right. They were still fresh and slightly covered with little snow. A woman had just passed that way. This woman was walking in the direction in which the child had seen the smoke. With his eyes fixed on the footprints, he set himself to follow them. End of chapter 1. All right. So, book 3, chapter 1, we go back to the abandoned child, where we left him last. He is in Portland. No inns. No, he has no money. It is storming. It's very cold. It is January night. So he can't see. He's in a place he's never been. There's no inns. There's no shops. There's no homes. There's no shelter of any kind. And he sees off into a distance some smoke. And he starts going that way because he thinks where there's smoke, there's going to be people. So That is the trek that he starts making. And this chapter pretty much just says all of the horrible, terrible things, how he could die just by like misstepping. Um, so far, so good. And he finds in the snow tracks of bare feet that probably belong to a woman. And the way that the bare feet are going is towards the smoke, which is where he was going anyway. Cool. Cool, 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 cool. All right. Chapter 2. The effect of snow. He journeyed some time along this course. Unfortunately, the footprints were becoming less and less distinct. Dense and fearful was the falling of the snow. It was the time when the hooker was so distressed by the snowstorm at sea. The child, in distress like the vessel, but after another fashion, had, in the inextricable intersection of shadows which rose up before him, no resource but the footsteps in the snow, and he held to it as the thread of a labyrinth. Suddenly, whether the snow had filled them up or for some other reason, the footsteps ceased. All became level, even, smooth, without a stain, without a detail. There was now nothing but a white cloth drawn over the earth and a black one over the sky. It seemed as if the foot-passenger had flown away. The child, in despair, bent down and searched, but in vain. As he arose, he had a sensation of hearing some indistinct sound, but he could not be sure of it. It resembled a voice, a breath, a shadow. It was more human than animal, more sepulchral than living. It was a sound, but the sound of a dream. He looked, but saw nothing. Solitude, wide, naked, and livid, was before him. He listened. That which he had thought he heard had faded away. Perhaps it had been but fancy. He still listened. All was silent. There was illusion in the mist. He went on his way again. He walked forward at random, with nothing henceforth to guide him. As he moved away, the noise began again. This time he could doubt it no longer. It was a groan, almost a sob. He turned. He searched the darkness of space with his eyes. He saw nothing. The sound arose once more. If Limbo could cry out, it would cry in such a tone. Nothing so penetrating, so piercing, so feeble as the voice, for it was a voice. It arose from a soul. There was a palpitation in the murmur. Nevertheless, it seemed uttered almost unconsciously. It was an appeal of suffering, not knowing that it suffered or that it appealed. The cry, perhaps a first breath, perhaps a last sigh, was equally distant from the rattle which closes life and the wail with which it commences. It breathed. It was stifled. It wept, a gloomy supplication from the depths of night. The child fixed his attention everywhere, far, near, on high, below. There was no one. There was nothing. He listened. The voice arose again. He perceived it distinctly. The sound somewhat resembled the bleating of a lamb. Then he was frightened, and thought of flight. The groan again. This was the fourth time. It was strangely miserable and plaintive. One felt that after that last effort, more mechanical than voluntary, the cry would probably be extinguished. It was an expiring exclamation, instinctively appealing to the amount of aid held in suspense in space. It was some muttering of agony addressed to a possible providence. The child approached in the direction from whence the sound came. Still he saw nothing. He advanced again, watchfully. The complaint continued. Inarticulate and confused as it was, it had become clear, almost vibrating. The child was near the voice. But where was it? He was close to a complaint. The trembling of a cry passed by his side into space. A human moan floated away into the darkness. This was what he had met. Such, at least, was his impression, dim as the dense mist in which he was lost. Whilst he hesitated between an instinct which urged him to fly and an instinct which commanded him to remain, he perceived in the snow at his feet, a few steps before him, a sort of undulation of the dimensions of a human body. A little eminence, long, low, and narrow, like the mold over a grave, a sepulchre in a white churchyard. At the same time the voice cried out. It was from beneath the undulation that it proceeded. The child bent down, crouching before the undulation, and with both hands began to clear it away. Beneath the snow which he removed, a form grew under his hands, and suddenly in the hollow he made there appeared a pale face. The cry had not proceeded from that face. Its eyes were shut, and the mouth opened, but full of snow. It remained motionless. It stirred not under the hands of the child. The child, whose fingers were numbed with frost, shuddered when he touched its coldness. It was that of a woman. Her disheveled hair was mingled with the snow. The woman was dead. Again the child set himself to sweep away the snow. The neck of the dead woman appeared, then her shoulders, clothed in rags. Suddenly he felt something move feebly under his touch. It was something small that was buried, and which stirred. The child swiftly cleared away the snow, discovering a wretched little body, thin, wan with cold, still alive, lying naked on the dead woman's naked breast. It was a little girl. It had been swaddled up, but in rags so scanty that in its struggles it had freed itself from its tatters. Under it its attenuated limbs, and above it its breath, had somewhat melted the snow. A nurse would have said that it was 5 or 6 months old, but perhaps it might be a year, for growth, in poverty, suffers heartbreaking reductions, when sometimes even produce bronchitis. When its face was exposed to the air, it gave a cry, the continuation of its sobs of distress. For the mother not to have heard that sob proved her irrevocably dead. The child took the infant in his arms. The stiffened body of the mother was a fearful sight. A spectral light proceeded from her face. The mouth, apart and without breath, seemed to form in the indistinct language of shadows her answer to the questions put to the dead by the invisible. The ghastly reflection of the icy plains was on that countenance. There was the youthful forehead under the brown hair, the almost indignant knitting of the eyebrows, the pinched nostrils, the closed eyelids, the lashes glued together by the rime, and from the corners of the eyes to the corners of the mouth a deep channel of tears. The snow lighted up the corpse. Winter and the tomb are not adverse. The corpse is the icicle of man. The nakedness of her breasts was pathetic. They had fulfilled their purpose. On them was a sublime blight of the life infused into one being by another from whom life has fled, and maternal majesty was there instead of virginal purity. At the point of one of the nipples was a white pearl. It was a drop of milk, frozen. Let us explain at once. On the plains over which the deserted boy was passing, in his turn a beggar woman, nursing her infant and searching for a refuge, had lost her way a few hours before. Benumbed with cold, she had sunk under the tempest and could not rise again. The falling snow had covered her. So long as she was able, she had clasped her little girl to her bosom, and thus died. The infant had tried to suck the marble breast, blind trust, inspired by nature, for it seemed that it is possible for a woman to suckle her child even after her last sigh. But the lips of the infant had been unable to find the breast where the drop of milk, stolen by death, had frozen, whilst under the snow the child, more accustomed to the cradle than the tomb, had wailed. The deserted child had heard the cry of the dying child. He disinterred it. He took it in his arms. When she felt herself in his arms, she ceased crying. The faces of the two children touched each other, and the purple lips of the infant sought the cheek of the boy as it had been a breast. The little girl had nearly reached the moment when the congealed blood stops the action of the heart. Her mother had touched her with the chill of her own death. A corpse communicates death. Its numbness is infectious. Her feet, hands, arms, knees seemed paralyzed by cold. The boy felt the terrible chill. He had on him a garment dry and warm, his pilot jacket. He placed the infant on the breast of the corpse, took off his jacket, wrapped the infant in it, took it up again in his arms, and now, almost naked, under the blast of the north wind which covered him with the eddies of snowflakes, carrying the infant, he pursued his journey. The little one, having succeeded in finding the boy's cheek, again applied her lips to it, and soothed by the warmth, she slept. First kiss of those two souls in the darkness. The mother lay there, her back to the snow, her face to the night. But perhaps at the moment when the little boy stripped himself to clothe the little girl, the mother saw him from the depths of infinity. End of chapter 2. Okay, so the boy is following these footprints and hears like this sighing, this moan. He's not quite sure if it's human, if it's animal, it's something in between. And then he comes across this like lump and he like digs through it and he finds this woman who had died. And then he hears like the little noise again, and so he like keeps digging and digging and digging, and then he finds a little kid who is crying and trying to be with her mom. And what had happened is the mom was a beggar and trying to find food and shelter for her and her child, and had succumbed to the cold and to the snow and had died. And so the child that we have been following, picks up the little kid and wraps her in his only form of warmth, which is a jacket, and puts her back down on the ground. And that's where we left off. Chapter 3. A burden makes a rough road rougher. It was a little more than 4 hours since the hooker had sailed from the creek of Portland, leaving the boy on the shore. During the long hours since he had been deserted, and had been journeying onwards, he had met but 3 persons of that human society into which he was, perchance, about to enter. A man, the man on the hill, a woman, the woman in the snow, and the little girl, whom he was carrying in his arms. He was exhausted by fatigue and hunger, yet advanced more resolutely than ever, with less strength and an added burden. He was now almost naked. The few rags which remained to him, hardened by the frost, were sharp as glass, and cut his skin. He became colder, but the infant was warmer. That which he lost was not thrown away, but was gained by her. He found out that the poor infant enjoyed the comfort which was to her the renewal of life. He continued to advance. From time to time, still holding her securely, he bent down, and, taking a handful of snow, he rubbed his feet with it, to prevent their being frostbitten. At other times, his throat feeling as if it were on fire, he put a little snow in his mouth and sucked it. This for a moment assuaged his thirst, but changed it into fever, a relief which was in aggravation. The storm had become shapeless from its violence. Deluges of snow are possible. This was one. The paraxium scourged the shore at the same time that it uptore the depths of ocean. This was, perhaps, the moment when the distracted hooker was going to pieces in the battle of the breakers. He traveled under this north wind, still towards the east, over wide surfaces of snow. He knew not how the hours had passed. For a long time he had ceased to see the smoke. Such indications are soon effaced in the night. Besides, it was past the hour when fires are put out. Or he had, perhaps, made the mistake, and it was possible that neither town nor village existed in the direction in which he was traveling. Doubting, he yet persevered. 2 or 3 times the little infant cried. Then he adopted in his gait a rocking movement, and the child was soothed and silenced. She ended by falling into a sound sleep. Shivering himself, he felt her warm. He frequently tightened the folds of the jacket round the babe's neck, so that the frost should not get in through any opening, and that no melted snow should drop between the garment and the child. The plain was unequal. In the declivities into which it sloped, the snow, driven by the wind into the dips of the ground, was so deep, in comparison with a child so small, that it almost engulfed him, and he had to struggle through it half buried. He walked on, working away the snow with his knees. Having cleared the ravine, he reached the high lands swept by the winds, where the snow lay thin. Then he found the surface a sheet of ice. The little girl's lukewarm breath, playing on his face, warmed it for a moment, then lingered and froze in his hair, stiffening it into icicles. He felt the approach of another danger. He could not afford to fall. He knew that, if he did so, he should never rise again. He was overcome by fatigue, and the weight of the darkness would, as with the dead woman, have held him to the ground, and the ice glued him alive to the earth. He had tripped upon the slopes of precipices and had recovered himself. He had stumbled into the holes and had got out again. Thenceforward the slightest fall would be death. A false step opened for him a tomb. He must not slip. He had not strength to rise even to his knees. Now everything was slippery. Everywhere there was rime and frozen snow. The little creature whom he carried made his progress fearfully difficult. He was not only a burden, which his weariness and exhaustion made excessive, but was also an embarrassment. She occupied both his arms, and to him who walks over ice, both arms are a natural and necessary balancing power. He was obliged to do without his balance. He did without it and advanced, bending under his burden, not knowing what would become of him. This little infant was the drop causing the cup of distress to overflow. He advanced, reeling at every step, as if on a springboard, and accomplishing, without spectators, miracles of equilibrium. Let us repeat that he was, perhaps, followed on this path of pain by eyes unsleeping in the distance of the shadows, the eyes of the mother and the eyes of God. He staggered, slipped, recovered himself, took care of the infant, and gathering the jacket about her, he covered up her head, staggered again, advanced, slipped, then drew himself up. The cowardly wind drove against him. Apparently, he made much more way than was necessary. He was, to all appearance, on the plains where Bincleave's farm was afterwards established, between what are now called Spring Gardens and the parsonage house. Homesteads and cottages occupy the place of waste lands. Sometimes less than a century separates a steppe from a city. Suddenly, a lull having occurred in the icy blast which was blinding him, he perceived, at a short distance in front of him, a cluster of gables and of chimneys shown in relief by the snow. The reverse of a silhouette, a city painted in white on a black horizon, something like what we call nowadays a negative proof. Roofs, dwellings, shelter. He had arrived somewhere at last. He felt the ineffable encouragement of hope. The watch of a ship which was wandered from her course feels some such emotion when he cries, "Land ho!" He hurried his steps. At length, then, he was near mankind. He would soon be amidst living creatures. There was no longer anything to fear. There glowed within him that sudden warmth, security, that out of which he was emerging was over. Thenceforward there would no longer be night, nor winter, nor tempest. It seemed to him that he had left all evil chances behind him. The infant was no longer a burden. He almost ran. His eyes were fixed on the roofs. There was life there. He never took his eyes off them. A dead man might gaze thus on what might appear through the half-opened lid of his sepulchre. There were the chimneys of which he had seen the smoke. No smoke arose from them now. He was not long before he reached the house. He came to the outskirts of a town, an open street. At that period, bars to streets were falling into disuse. The street began by 2 houses. In those 2 houses neither candle nor lamp was to be seen, nor in the whole street, nor in the whole town, so far as eye could reach. The house to the right was a roof rather than a house. Nothing could be more mean. The walls were of mud, the roof was of straw, and there was more thatch than wall. A large nettle, springing from the bottom of the wall, reached the roof. The hovel had but one door, which was like that of a dog kennel, and a window, which was but a hole. All was shut up. At the side an inhabited pigsty told that the house was also inhabited. The house on the left was large, high, built entirely of stone, with a slated roof. It was also closed. It was the rich man's home, opposite to that of the pauper. The boy did not hesitate. He approached the great mansion. The double folding door of massive oak, studded with large nails, was of the kind that leads one to expect that behind it there is a stout armory of bolts and locks. An iron knocker was attached to it. He raised the knocker with some difficulty, for his benumbed hands were stumps rather than hands. He knocked once. No answer. He struck again, and 2 knocks. No movement was heard in the house. He knocked a 3rd time. There was no sound. He saw that they were all asleep, and did not care to get up. Then he turned to the hovel. He picked up a pebble from the snow and knocked against the low door. There was no answer. He raised himself on tiptoe and knocked with his pebble against the pane, too softly to break the glass, but loud enough to be heard. No voice was heard. No step moved. No candle was lighted. He saw that there as well they did not care to awake. The house of stone and the thatched hovel were equally deaf to the wretched. The boy decided on pushing on further, and penetrating the street of houses which stretched away in front of him, so dark that it seemed more like a gulf between 2 cliffs than the entrance to a town. End of chapter 3. Okay, so in this chapter, the boy has scooped up the little girl child and is continuing on towards where he thinks the town is, like where the smoke he saw is. So he's on his way there, and it is proving to be difficult. There's a lot of uneven terrain, and everything is icy and snowy and super, super slippery. And so the arms that we usually use to balance himself, he can't use because he is holding on to this child. But he's going, and then he sees the beginnings of a town. And so he goes up there, and on one side of the street is a house that looks a little not well made, and maybe the person who lives here doesn't have like a super high paying job. Like the roof looks like it could blow over, like that sort of thing. And then across the street on the other side is a house that is basically a mansion. And so first the boy goes over to the mansion and knocks, and ends up knocking 3 separate times, and no time does somebody answer, or at no time does it sound like somebody is even moving. So then he goes back to the other house and knocks on the little door, and there's no answer at all. There's no light in either of these houses. There's no noises, nothing, nothing, nothing. And so he continues to go into the town, hoping that he will find somebody else. Hmm. Hmm. All right. Chapter 4. Another form of desert, which doesn't make me think that this is gonna be a good time, a good happy time. It was Weymouth, which he had just entered. Weymouth then was not the respectable and fine Weymouth of today. Ancient Weymouth did not present, like the present one, an irreproachable rectangular quay with an inn and a statue in honor of George III. This resulted from the fact that George III had not yet been born. For the same reason they had not yet designed on the slope of the green hill towards the east, fashioned flat on the soil by cutting away the turf and leaving the bare chalk to the view, the white horse, an acre long, bearing the king upon his back, and always turning, in honor of George III, his tail to the city. These honors, however, were deserved. George III, having lost in his old age the intellect he had never possessed in his youth, was not responsible for the calamities of his reign. He was an innocent. Why not erect a statue of him? Weymouth 180 years ago was about as symmetrical as a game of spillikins in confusion. In legends it is said that Astaroth traveled over the world, carrying on her back a wallet which contained everything, even good women in their houses. A pell-mell of sheds thrown from her devil's bag would give an idea of that irregular Weymouth. The good women in the sheds included. The music hall remains as a specimen of those buildings, a confusion of wooden dens, carved and eaten by worms, which carve in another fashion, shapeless, overhanging buildings, some with pillars leaning one against the other for support against the sea wind, and having between them awkward spaces of narrow and winding channels, lanes, and passages, often flooded by the equinoctial tides, a heap of old grandmother houses crowded round a grandfather church. Such was Weymouth, a sort of old Norman village thrown up on the coast of England. The traveller who entered the tavern, now replaced by the hotel, instead of paying royally his 25 francs for a fried sole and a bottle of wine, had to suffer the humiliation of eating a pennyworth of soup made of fish, which soup, by the by, was very good. Wretched fare. The deserted child carrying the foundling passed through the first street, then the second, then the third. He raised his eyes, seeking in the higher stories and in the roofs a lighted window-pane, but all were closed and dark. At intervals he knocked at the doors. No one answered. Nothing makes the heart so like a stone as being warm between sheets. The noise and the shaking had at length awakened the infant. He knew this because he felt her suck his cheek. She did not cry, believing him her mother. He was about to turn and wander long, perhaps, in the intersections of the Scrambridge lanes, where there were then more cultivated plots than dwellings, more thorn hedges than houses. But fortunately, he struck into a passage which exists to this day near Trinity Schools. This passage led him to a water brink, where there was a roughly built quay with a parapet, and to the right he made out a bridge. It was the bridge over the Wey, connecting Weymouth and Melcombe Regis, and under the arches of which the backwater joins the harbour. Weymouth, a hamlet, was then the suburb of Melcombe Regis, a city and port. Now Melcombe Regis is a parish of Weymouth. The village has absorbed the city. It was the bridge which did the work. Bridges are strange vehicles of suction, which inhale the population and sometimes swell one river bank at the expense of its opposite neighbor. The boy went to the bridge, which at that period was a covered timber structure. He crossed it. Thanks to its roofing, there was no snow on the planks. His bare feet had a moment's comfort as they crossed them. Having passed over the bridge, he was in Melcombe Regis. There were fewer wooden houses than stone ones there. He was no longer in the village. He was in the city. The bridge opened on a rather fine street called St. Thomas's Street. He entered it. Here and there were high, carved gables and shop fronts. He set to knocking at the doors again. He had no strength left to call or shout. At Melcombe Regis, as at Weymouth, no one was stirring. The doors were all carefully double-locked. The windows were covered by their shutters, as the eyes by their lids. Every precaution had been taken to avoid being roused by disagreeable surprises. The little wanderer was suffering the indefinable depression made by a sleeping town. Its silence, as of a paralyzed ant's nest, makes the head swim. All its lethargies mingle their nightmares. Its slumbers are a crowd, and from its human bodies lying prone there arises a vapor of dreams. Sleep has gloomy associates beyond this life. The decomposed thoughts of the sleepers float above them in a mist which is both of death and of life, and combined with the possible, which has also, perhaps, the power of thought, as it floats in space. Hence arrive entanglements. Dreams, those clouds, interpose their folds and their transparencies over that star, the mind. Above those closed eyelids, where vision has taken the place of sight, a sepulchral disintegration of outlines and appearances dilates itself into impalpability. Mysterious, diffused existences amalgamate themselves with the life on that border of death which sleep is. Those larvae and souls mingle in the air. Even he who sleeps not feels a medium press upon him full of sinister life. The surrounding chimera, in which he suspects a reality, impedes him. The waking man, wending his way amidst the sleep phantoms of others, unconsciously pushes back passing shadows, has, or imagines that he has, a vague fear of adverse contact with the invisible, and feels at every moment the obscure pressure of a hostile encounter which immediately dissolves. There is something of the effect of a forest in the nocturnal diffusion of dreams. This is what is called being afraid without reason. What a man feels, a child feels still more. The uneasiness of nocturnal fear, increased by the spectral houses, increased the weight of the sad burden under which he was struggling. He entered Conicar Lane, and perceived at the end of that passage the backwater, which he took for the ocean. He no longer knew in what direction the sea lay. He retracted his steps, struck to the left by Maiden Street, and returned as far as St. Albans Row. There, by chance and without selection, he knocked violently at any house that he happened to pass. His blows, on which he was expending his last energies, were jerky and without aim, now ceasing altogether for a time, now renewed as if in irritation. It was the violence of his fever striking against the doors. One voice answered, that of time. 3 o'clock tolled slowly behind him from the old belfry of St. Nicholas. Then all sank into silence again. That no inhabitant should have opened a lattice may appear surprising. Nevertheless, that silence is in a great measure to be explained. We must remember that in January 1790 they were just over a somewhat severe outbreak of the plague in London, and that the fear of receiving sick vagabonds caused a diminution of hospitality everywhere. People would not even open their windows for fear of inhaling the poison. The child felt the coldness of men more terribly than the coldness of night. The coldness of men is intentional. He felt a tightening on his sinking heart which he had not known on the open plains. Now he had entered into the midst of life, and remained alone. This was the summit of misery. The pitiless desert he had understood. The unrelenting town was too much to bear. The hour, the strokes of which he had just counted, had been another blow. Nothing is so freezing in certain situations as the voice of the hour. It is a declaration of indifference. It is eternity saying, "What does it matter to me?" He stopped, and it is not certain that, in that miserable minute, he did not ask himself whether it would not be easier to lie down there and die. However, the little infant leaned her head against his shoulder and fell asleep again. This blind confidence set him onwards again. He, whom all supports were failing, felt that he was himself a basis of support. Irresistible summons of duty. Neither such ideas nor such a situation belonged to his age. It is probable that he did not understand them. It was a matter of instinct. He did what he chanced to do. He set out again in the direction of Johnstone Row. But now he no longer walked. He dragged himself along. He left St. Mary's Street at the left, made zigzags through lanes, and at the end of the winding passage found himself in a rather wide, open space. It was a piece of waste land, not built up, probably the spot where Chesterfield Place now stands. The houses ended there. He perceived the sea to the right, and scarcely anything more of the town to his left. What was to become of him? Here was the country again. To the east, great inclined plains of snow marked out the wide slopes of Radipole. Should he continue his journey? Should he advance and re-enter the solitudes? Should he return and re-enter the streets? What was he to do between those two silences, the mute plain and the deaf city? Which of the two refusals should he choose? This is the anchor of mercy. There is also the look of piteousness. It was that look which the poor little despairing wanderer threw around himself. All at once, he heard a menace. End of chapter 4. Okay, so he continues into the town after those two homes just didn't get up, didn't move at all. And he's going into past the town and ends up going into like the city. And he's knocking on doors and nobody is answering. He keeps going around and everybody is ignoring him. Um, the church bells ring 3 o'clock and nobody opens their doors, nobody stirs, nothing. And there's a point where Victor Hugo has a line that says that the weather is cruel, but so are people, and the people are like their coldness is intentional, which harkens back to when the child was first left and had that feeling of being left by all of humanity, not just the people on the ship, but all of humanity had abandoned him. So this is like a recurring feeling and a recurring theme thus far. And now he has to decide whether he's going to continue in the city where people are intentionally ignoring him or go out to the plains where there is nobody. Between a rock and a hard place. All right. Chapter 5. Misanthropy plays its pranks. A strange and alarming grinding of teeth reached him through the darkness. It was enough to drive one back. He advanced. To those to whom silence has become dreadful, a howl is comforting. That fierce growl reassured him. That threat was a promise. There was there a being alive and awake, though it might be a wild beast. He advanced in the direction whence came the snarl. He turned the corner of a wall, and behind the vast sepulchral light, made by the reflection of snow and sea, he saw a thing placed as if for shelter. It was a cart, unless it was a hovel. It had wheels, it was a carriage. It had a roof, it was a dwelling. From the roof arose a funnel, and out of the funnel smoke. This smoke was red, and seemed to imply a good fire in the interior. Behind, projecting hinges indicated a door, and in the center of this door a square opening showed a light inside the caravan. He approached. Whatever had growled perceived his approach and became furious. It was no longer a growl which he had to meet. It was a roar. He heard a sharp sound, as of a chain violently pulled to its full length, and suddenly, under the door, between the hind wheels, 2 rows of sharp, white teeth appeared. At the same time as the mouth between the wheels, a head was put through the window. "Peace there," said the head. The mouth was silent. The head began again. "Is anyone there?" The child answered. "Yes." "Who?" "I." "You? Who are you? Whence do you come?" "I am weary," said the child. "What o'clock is it?" "I am cold." "What are you doing there?" "I am hungry," the head replied. "Everyone cannot be as happy as a lord. Go away." The head was withdrawn and the window closed. The child bowed his forehead, drew the sleeping infant closer in his arms, and collected his strength to resume his journey. He had taken a few steps and was hurrying away. However, at the same time that the window closed, the door had opened. A step had been let out. The voice which had spoken to the child cried out angrily from inside the van. "Well, why do you not enter?" The child turned back. "Come in," resumed the voice. "Who has sent me a fellow like this? Who is hungry and cold, and who does not come in?" The child, at once repulsed and invited, remained motionless. The voice continued. "You are told to come in, you young rascal." He made up his mind and placed one foot on the lowest step. There was a great growl under the van. He drew back. The gaping jaws appeared. "Peace!" cried the voice of the man. The jaws retreated. The growling ceased. "Come up," continued the man. The child with difficulty climbed up the 3 steps. He was impeded by the infant, so benumbed, rolled up and enveloped in the jacket that nothing could be distinguished of her, and she was but a little shapeless mass. He passed over the 3 steps, and having reached the threshold, stopped. No candle was burning in the caravan, probably from the economy of want. The hut was lighted only by a red tinge arising from the opening at the top of the stove, in which sparkled a peat fire. On the stove were smoking a porringer and a saucepan, containing to all appearance something to eat. The savory odor was perceptible. The hut was furnished with a chest, a stool, and an unlighted lantern which hung from the ceiling. Besides, to the partition were attached some boards on brackets and some hooks, from which hung a variety of things. On the boards and nails were rows of glasses, coppers, an alembic, a vessel rather like those used for graining wax, which are called granulators, and a confusion of strange objects of which the child understood nothing, and which were utensils for cooking and chemistry. The caravan was oblong in shape, the stove being in front. It was not even a little room. It was scarcely a big box. There was more light outside from the snow than inside from the stove. Everything in the caravan was distinct and misty. Nevertheless, a reflection of the fire on the ceiling enabled the spectator to read in large letters, "Ursus, philosopher." The child, in fact, was entering the house of Homo and Ursus. Homo's the dog, or the wolf. The one he had just heard growling, the other speaking. The child, having reached the threshold, perceived near the stove a man, tall, smooth, thin, and old, dressed in gray, whose head, as he stood, reached the roof. The man could not have raised himself on tiptoe. The caravan was just his size. "Come in," said the man who was Ursus. The child entered. "Put down your bundle." The child placed his burden carefully on the top of the chest for fear of awakening and terrifying it. The man continued. "How gently you put it down! You could not be more careful were it a case of relics. Is that you are afraid of tearing a hole in your rags? Worthless vagabond, in the streets at this hour. Who are you? Answer. But no, I forbid you to answer. There, you are cold. Warm yourself as quick as you can." And he shoved him by the shoulders in front of the fire. "How wet you are! You're frozen through. A nice state to come into a house. Come, take off your rags, you villain." And as with one hand, and with feverish haste, he dragged off the boy's rags, which tore into shreds, with the other he took down from a nail a man's shirt, and one of those knitted jackets, which are up to this day called kiss-me-quicks. "Here are clothes." He chose out of a heap a woolen rag, and chafed before the fire the limbs of the exhausted and bewildered child, who at that moment, warm and naked, felt as if he were seeing and touching heaven. The limbs having been rubbed, he next wiped the boy's feet. "Come, you limb, you have nothing frostbitten. There we go. I was a fool to fancy you had something frozen. Hind legs or forepaws. You will not lose the use of them this time. Dress yourself." The child put on the shirt, and the man slipped the knitted jacket over it. "Now." The man kicked the stool forward and made the little boy sit down, again shoving him by the shoulders. Then he pointed with his finger to the porringer, which was smoking upon the stove. What the child saw in the porringer was again heaven to him, namely, a potato and a bit of bacon. Delicious. "You are hungry. Eat." The man took from the shelf a crust of hard bread and an iron fork, and handed them to the child. The boy hesitated. "Perhaps you expect me to lay the cloth?" said the man, and he placed the porringer on the child's lap. "Gobble that up." Hunger overcame astonishment. The child began to eat. The poor boy devoured rather than ate. The glad sound of the crunching of bread filled the hut. The man grumbled. "Not so quick, you horrid glutton. Isn't he a greedy scoundrel? When such scum are hungry, they eat in a revolting fashion. You should see a lord sup. In my time, I have seen dukes eat. They don't eat. That's noble. They drink, however. Come, you pig, stuff yourself." The absence of ears, which is the concomitant of a hungry stomach, caused the child to take little heed of these violent epithets, tempered as they were by charity of action involving a contradiction resulting in his benefit. For the moment he was absorbed by two exigencies, and by two ecstasies, food and warmth. Ursus continued his imprecations, muttering to himself. "I have seen King James supping in the banqueting house, where are to be admired the paintings of the famous Rubens. His Majesty touched nothing. This beggar here browses. Browses, a word derived from brute. What put it into my head to come to this Weymouth 7 times, devoted to the infernal deities? I have sold nothing since morning. I have harangued the snow. I have played the flute to the hurricane. I have not pocketed a farthing. And now, tonight, beggars drop in. Horrid place. There is battle, struggle, competition between the fools in the street and myself. They try to give me nothing but farthings. I try to give them nothing but drugs. Well, today I've made nothing. Not an idiot on the highway. Not a penny in the till. Eat away, hell-born boy. Tear and crunch. We have fallen on times when nothing can equal the cynicism of spongers. Fatten at my expense, parasite. This wretched boy is more than hungry. He is mad. It is not appetite. It is voracity. He is carried away by a rabid virus. Perhaps he has the plague. Have you the plague, you thief? Suppose he were to give it to you, Homo. No, never. Let the populace die, but not my wolf. But, by the by, I am hungry myself. I declare that this is all very disagreeable. I have worked far into the night. There are seasons in a man's life when he is hard pressed. I was tonight by hunger. I was alone. I made a fire. I had but one potato, one crust of bread, a mouthful of bacon, and a drop of milk, and I put it to warm. I said to myself, good. I think I am going to eat, and bang, this crocodile files upon me at the very moment. He installs himself clean between my food and myself. Behold, how my larder is devastated. Eat, pike. Eat. You shark, how many teeth have you in your jaws? Guzzle, wolf cub. No, I withdraw that word. I respect wolves. Swallow up my food, boa. I have worked all day and far into the night, on an empty stomach. My throat is sore, my pancreas is distress, my entrails torn, and my reward is to see another eat. 'Tis all one, though. We will divide. He shall have the bread, the potato, and the bacon, but I will have the milk. Just then, a wail, touching and prolonged, arose from the hut. The man listened. You cry, sycophant. Why do you cry? The boy turned towards him. It was evident that it was not he who cried. He had his mouth full. The cry continued. The man went to the chest. So it is your bundle that wails. Veil of Jehoshaphat? Behold, a phosphorating parcel. What the devil has your bundle got to croak about? He unrolled the jacket. An infant's head appeared, the mouth open and crying. Well, who goes there? Said the man. Here is another of them. When is this to end? Who is there? To arms. Corporal, call out the guard. Another bang. What have you brought me, thief? Don't you see it is thirsty? Come, the little one must have a drink. So now I shall not have even the milk. He took down from the things lying in disorder on the shelf a bandage of linen, a sponge, and a vial, muttering savagely, What an infernal place! Then he looked at the infant. 'Tis a girl. One can tell that by her scream, and she is drenched as well. He dragged away, as he had done from the boy, the tatters in which she was knotted up rather than dressed, and swathed her in a rag which, though of coarse linen, was clean and dry. This rough and sudden dressing made the infant angry. She mews relentlessly, said he. He bit off a long piece of sponge, tore from the roll a square piece of linen, drew from it a bit of thread, took the saucepan containing the milk from the stove, filled the vial with milk, drove down the sponge halfway into its neck, covered the sponge with linen, tied this cork in with a thread, applied his cheek to the vial to be sure that it was not too hot, and seized under his left arm the bewildered bundle, which was still crying. Come, take your supper, creature. Let me suckle you. And he put the neck of the bottle to its mouth. The little infant drank greedily. He held the vial at the necessary incline, grumbling, They are all the same, the cowards. When they have all they want, they are silent. The child had drunk so ravenously, and had seized so eagerly this breast offered by a cross-grained Providence, that she was taken with a fit of coughing. You are going to choke? Growled Ursus. A fine gobbler, this one. He drew away the sponge which she was sucking, allowed the cough to subside, and then replaced the vial to her lips, saying, Suck, you little wretch. In the meantime, the boy had laid down his fork. Seeing the infant drink had made him forget to eat. The moment before, while he ate, the expression in his face was satisfaction. Now it was gratitude. He watched the infant's renewal of life. The completion of the resurrection begun by himself filled his eyes with an ineffable brilliancy. Ursus went on muttering angry words between his teeth. The little boy now and then lifted towards Ursus his eyes, moist with the unspeakable emotion which the poor little being felt, but was unable to express. Ursus addressed him furiously. Well, will you eat? And you? Said the child, trembling all over and with tears in his eyes. You will have nothing. Will you be kind enough to eat it all up, you cub? There is not too much for you, since there was not enough for me. The child took up his fork, but did not eat. Eat, shouted Ursus. What has it got to do with me? Who speaks of me? Wretched little barefooted clerk of a penniless parish. I tell you, eat it all up. You are here to eat, drink, and sleep. Eat, or I will kick you out, both of you. The boy, under this menace, began to eat again. He had not much trouble in finishing what was left in the porringer. Ursus muttered, "This building is badly joined. The cold comes in by the window pane." The pane had indeed been broken in front, either by a jolt of the caravan or by a stone thrown by some mischievous boy. Ursus had placed a star of paper over the fracture, which had become unpasted. The blast entered there. He was half seated on the chest, the infant in his arms, and at the same time on his lap was sucking rapturously at the bottle, in the happy solemnity of cherubim before their creator, and infants at their mother's breast. "She is drunk," said Ursus, and he continued, "After this, preach sermons on temperance." The wind tore from the pane the plaster of paper, which flew across the hut, but this was nothing to the children, who were entering life anew, whilst the little girl drank, and the little boy ate. Ursus grumbled. "Drunkenness begins in the infant in swaddling clothes. What useful trouble, Bishop! Tillotson gives himself, thundering against excessive drinking. What an odious draught of wind! And then my stove is cold. Is old. It allows puffs of smoke to escape enough to give you trichiasis. One has the inconvenience of cold and the inconvenience of fire. One cannot see clearly. That being over there abuses my hospitality. Well, I have not been able to distinguish the animal's face yet. Comfort is wanting here. By Jove, I am a great admirer of exquisite banquets in well-closed rooms. I have missed my vocation. I was born to be a sensualist. The greatest of Stoics was Philoxenus, who wished to possess the neck of a crane, so as to be longer in tasting the pleasures of the table. Receipts today, naught. Nothing sold all day. Inhabitants, servants, and tradesmen, here is the doctor. Here are the drugs. You are losing your time, old friend. Pack up your physics. Everyone is well down here. It's a cursed town, where everyone is well. The skies alone have diarrhea. How dare the sky be the only one with diarrhea? Anaxagoras taught that the snow was black, and he was right, cold being blackness. Ice is the night. What a hurricane! I can fancy the delight of those at sea. The hurricane is the passage of demons. It is the row of the tempest fiends galloping and rolling head over heels above our bone boxes. In the cloud this one has a tail, that one has horns, another a flame for a tongue, another claws to its wings, another a Lord Chancellor's paunch, another an academician's pate. You may observe a form in every sound, to every fresh wind a fresh demon. The ear hears, the eye sees, the crash is a face. Zounds, there are folks at sea, that is certain. My friends, get through the storm as best you can. I have enough to do to get through life. Come now, do I keep an inn, or do I not? Why should I trade with these travelers? The universal distress sends its spatterings even as far as my poverty. Into my cabin fall hideous drops of the far-spreading mud of mankind. I am given up to the voracity of travelers. I am a prey, the prey of those dying of hunger. Winter, night, a pasteboard hut, an unfortunate friend below and without, the storm, a potato, a fire as big as my fist, parasites, the wind penetrating through every cranny, not a halfpenny, and bundles which set to howling. I open them and find beggars inside. Is this fair? Besides, the laws are violated. Ah, vagabond with your vagabond child, mischievous pickpocket, ill-minded abortion, so you walk the street after curfew. And if our good king only knew it, would he not have you thrown into the bottom of a ditch just to teach you better? My gentleman walks out at night with my lady, and with the glass at 15 degrees of frost, bareheaded and barefooted. Understand that such things are forbidden. There are rules and regulations, you lawless wretches. Vagabonds are punished. Honest folks who have houses are guarded and protected. Kings are the fathers of their people. I have my own house. You would have been whipped in the public street had you chanced to have been met, and quite right, too. There must be order in an established city. For my own part, I did wrong not to denounce you to the constable, but I am such a fool. I understand what is right, and do what is wrong. Oh, the ruffian! To come here in such a state! I did not see the snow upon them when they came in. It had melted, and here's my whole house swamped. I have inundation in my home. I shall have to burn an incredible amount of coals to dry up this lake. Coals, at 12 farthings the mariner's standards. How am I going to manage to fit 3 into this caravan? Now it is over. I entered the nursery. I am going to have in my house the weaning of the future beggardom of England. I shall have for employment, office, and function to fashion the miscarried fortunes of that colossal prostitute, Misery, to bring to perfection future gallows birds, and to give young thieves the forms of philosophy. The tongues of the wolves is the warning of God. And to think that if I had not been eaten up by creatures of this kind for the last 30 years, I should be rich. My wolf would be fat. I should have a medicine chest full of rarities, as many surgical instruments as Dr. Linacre, surgeon to King Henry VIII, divers animals of all kinds, Egyptian mummies, and similar curiosities. I should be a member of the College of Physicians, and have the right of using the library built in 1652 by the celebrated Hervey, and of studying in the lantern of that dome whence you can see the whole of London. I could continue my observations of solar obfuscation, and prove that a collision's vapor arises from the planet. Such was the opinion of John Kepler, who was born the year before the massacre of St. Bartholomew, and who was the mathematician of the emperor. The sun is a chimney which sometimes smokes. So does my stove. My stove is no better than the sun. Yes, I should have made my fortune. My part would have been a different one. I should not be the insignificant fellow I am. I should not degrade science in the highways, for the crowd is not worthy of the doctrine, the crowd being nothing better than a confused mixture of all sorts of ages, sexes, humours, and conditions, that wise men of all periods have not hesitated to despise, and whose extravagance and passion the most moderate men in their justice detest. Oh, I am weary of existence. After all, one does not live long. The human life is soon done with, but no, it is long. At intervals that we should not become too discouraged, that we may have the stupidity to consent to bear our being, and not profit by the magnificent opportunities to hang ourselves, which cords and nails afford, nature puts on an air of taking a little care of man. Not tonight, though. The rogue causes the wheat to spring up, ripens the grape, gives her song to the nightingale. From time to time a ray of morning or a glass of gin, and that is what we call happiness. It is a narrow border of good round a huge winding sheet of evil. We have a destiny of which the devil has woven the stuff, and God has sewn the hem. In the meantime, you have eaten my supper, you thief. In the meantime, the infant whom he was holding all the time in his arms very tenderly, whilst he was vituperating, shut his eyes languidly, a sign of repletion. Ursus examined the vial and grumbled. She has drunk it all up, the impudent creature. He rose, and sustaining the infant with his left arm, with his right he raised the lid of the chest and drew beneath it a bear skin, the one he called, as will be remembered, his real skin. Whilst he was doing this, he heard the other child eating, and looked at him sideways. It will be nothing to do if henceforth I have to feed that growing glutton. It will be a worm gnawing at the vitals of my industry. He spread out, still with one arm, the bearskin on the chest, working his elbow and managing his movements so as not to disturb the sleep into which the infant was just sinking. Then he laid her down on the fur, on the side next to the fire. Having done so, he placed the vial on the stove and exclaimed, "I'm thirsty, if you like." He looked into the pot. There were a few good mouthfuls of milk left in it. He raised it to his lips. Just as he was about to drink, his eye fell upon the little girl. He replaced the pot on the stove, took the vial, uncorked it, poured into it all of the milk that remained, which was just sufficient to fill it, replaced the sponge with the linen rag over it, and tied it round the neck of the bottle. "All the same, I'm hungry and thirsty," he observed. And he added, "When one cannot eat bread, one must drink water." Behind the stove there was a jug with the spout off. He took it and handed it to the boy. "Will you drink?" The child drank, and then went on eating. Ursus seized the pitcher again and conveyed it to his mouth. The temperature of the water which it contained had been unequally modified by the proximity of the stove. He swallowed some mouthfuls and made a grimace. "Water, pretending to be pure, thou resemblest false friends. Thou art warm at the top and cold at the bottom." In the meantime, the boy had finished his supper. The porringer was more than empty. It was cleared out. He picked up and ate pensively a few crumbs caught in the folds of the knitted jacket on his lap. Ursus turned towards him. "That is not all. Now, a word with you. The mouth is not made only for eating. It was made for speaking. Now that you are warmed and stuffed, you beast, take care of yourself. You are going to answer my questions. Whence do you come?" The child replied, "I do not know." "What do you mean, you don't know?" "I was abandoned this evening on the seashore." "You little scamp. What's your name? He is so good for nothing that his relations desert him." "I have no relations." Give in a little to my tastes, and observe that I do not like those who sing a tune of fibs. Thou must have relatives, since you have a sister." "It's not my sister." "It is not your sister?" "No." "Who is it, then?" "It is a baby I found." "Found?" "Yes." "What, did you pick her up?" "Yes." "Where? If you lie, I will exterminate you." "On the breast of a woman who was dead in the snow." "When?" "An hour ago." "Where?" "A league from here." The arched brow of Ursus knitted, and took that pointed shape which characterizes emotion on the brow of a philosopher. "Dead. Lucky for her. We must leave her in the snow. She is well off there. In which direction?" "In the direction of the sea." "Did you cross the bridge?" "Yes." Ursus opened the window at the back and examined the view. The weather had not improved. The snow was falling thickly and mournfully. He shut the window. He went to the broken glass. He filled the hole with a rag. He heaped the stove with peat. He spared out as far as he could the bearskin on the chest, took a large book which he had in a corner, placed it under the skin for a pillow, and laid the head of the sleeping infant on it. Then he turned to the boy. "Lie down there." The boy obeyed and stretched himself at full length by the side of the infant. Ursus rolled the bearskin over the two children and tucked it under their feet. He took down from the shelf and tied round his waist a linen belt with a large pocket containing, no doubt, a case of instruments and bottles of restoratives. Then he took the lantern from where it hung to the ceiling and lighted it. It was a dark lantern. When lighted, it still left the children in shadow. Ursus half opened the door and said, "I am going out. Do not be afraid. I shall return. Go to sleep." Then, letting down the steps, he called Homo. He was answered by a loving growl. Ursus, holding the lantern in his hand, descended. The steps were replaced. The door was reclosed. The children remained alone. From without, the voice of Ursus said, "You, boy, who have just eaten up my supper, are you already asleep?" "No," replied the child. "Well, if she cries, give her the rest of the milk." The clinking of a chain being undone was heard, and the sound of a man's footsteps, mingled with that of the pads of an animal, died off in the distance. A few minutes after, both children slept profoundly. The little boy and girl lying naked side by side were joined through the silent hours in the seraphic promiscuousness of the shadows. Such dreams as were possible to their age floated from one to the other. Beneath their closed eyelids there shone, perhaps, a starlight. If the word marriage were not inappropriate to the situation, they were husband and wife after the fashion of the angels. Such innocence in such darkness, such purity in such an embrace, such foretastes of heaven are possible only to childhood, and no immensity approaches the greatness of little children. Of all gulfs, This is the deepest, the fearful perpetuity of the dead chained beyond life, the mighty animosity of the ocean to a wreck, the whiteness of the snow over buried bodies do not equal in pathos two children's mouths meeting divinely in sleep, and the meeting of which is not even a kiss. And we have a note right after two children's mouths meeting divinely in sleep, and it says, their lips were four red roses on a stem, which in their summer beauty kissed each other. Shakespeare. There's a reference to Shakespeare. That's fun. That's fun. A betrothal, perchance a catastrophe. The unknown weighs down upon their juxtaposition. It charms, it terrifies. Who knows which? It stays the pulse. Innocence is higher than virtue. Innocence is wholly ignorance. They slept. They were in peace. They were warm. The nakedness of their bodies embraced each in each, amalgamated with the virginity of their souls. They were there as in the nest of the abyss. End of chapter 5. All right, so we're back to Ursus. That's fun. I like that. Something that I forgot to mention after the last end of the chapter, at the end of chapter 4, is that something I appreciate that Victor Hugo does is bring in context. So he talks about like another reason why people are not so willing to help is because of the plague, and like bringing in that extra little oomph, the extra little salt, you know what I mean? But in this chapter, chapter 5, we are back with Ursus. The child knocks on his door, is asking for food, and Ursus is a hoot. The whole time Ursus is warming up both kids, feeding both of them, giving them a place to sleep. Um, Ursus doesn't have much food, and he just gives them all of the food. There's not much room there. And the whole time that this is happening, Ursus is pacing back and forth and just like saying how terrible everything is. How the kid is a beast and a thief and all of these other things, a vagabond. He's a shark, he's a boa, like all of these other things. And just how terrible everything is, and it's like, you ought to be punished because you don't have any shoes on, and you ought to be punished because you don't have a hat, and you ought to be punished because it is the middle of the night, and all of these other things. And this whole time he's just taking care of them. That's all it is. He's just taking care of them. And then he goes and once the child, who does not have a name yet, once the child has finished eating, he starts asking him questions like, where are you from? What's your name? All of these other things. And I noticed that the what is your name question was overlooked. So we know that the child has no relations, which we already knew. The Ursus just assumed that the girl was his sister, and he's like, no, I found this baby in the snow. Her mom is dead over that way. And so Ursus is like, good. She's better off to be dead right now. We'll leave her in the snow. But at the end of the chapter, Ursus like cuddles them together in his little bear skin and leaves extra milk for the baby, and says to the kid, like, if she wakes up screaming, give her more milk. And then he heads out with his wolf. And that's where we ended. And that's where we were going to end today. So we will pick up right where we left off last time. I am enjoying this. I still think like it's so bleak, and there is not an ounce of hope. I mean, maybe an ounce, but like not much. But it's super exciting. I'm really enjoying it. Victor Hugo has such a way of words and sharp commentary, and you can absolutely understand why he was banished from France. And this book was actually written while he was banished, so he's not even in France while he's writing this. So good on ya, you know. We'll continue right where we left off next time. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you all have a great night or whatever time zone you're in. I will see you next time. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. And as always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Have a good night, everyone. Goodbye.